Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford CS 193P. This is winter quarter of 2015. And we're going to dive right in today to some brief slide work. People at Stanford, you've got a document that describes all the grading and all that stuff, so I'm not going to go over that in lecture like I often do to start the quarter. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this class is about. Brief mention of the prerequisites because they're pretty important in this class. Then just the quickest overview of iOS. I'm going to assume anyone who's here or who's watching this knows what that is. And then we're going to dive right into a big old demo. It's going to be a two-day thing where I'm really going to try and introduce you to Xcode and the development environment and this language Swift that you're going to have to learn to develop for iOS. All right, so what is this class about? It's about building cool apps. As we know, why are these iOS apps so cool? Well, because the device you're going to run them on is in your pocket or in your backpack. If you write an app, you can just pull it out and show your friends. And it's highly networked and incredible graphics with animation. It's just cool all the way around. And I think you guys all know that or you wouldn't be here. But you're also going to learn in this class a lot of real-life object-oriented programming. You're taking a lot of other classes here at Stanford on things like graphics and networking and databases and maybe animation, things like that. And we're going to kind of tie that all together into a real-world class. Okay, you're going to get to see all this stuff. Now, you know, it's going to be kind of a survey course in that. I can't go too deep into networking. I can't go too deep into databases. I can't go too deep into animation, but you'll get to see it all in a really real-world environment where people are out there building apps using that technology. So for some of you who haven't seen that before, that'll be a big bonus of this class, I think. The prerequisite of this class, number one thing is you have to be a pretty strong object-oriented programmer. If you're not a strong object-oriented programmer and you hit this class, you're probably going to go underwater pretty quick. Okay, I'm going to assume you know everything about object-oriented programming. iOS is a completely object-oriented programming development environment. And I just don't mean, I'm not just talking about the language is object-oriented, but the entire design of it, the way you use it. If you're not comfortable with things like subclassing and stuff like that, then you're just really going to be behind the curve in iOS. So at Stanford here, that means CS 106A and B or CS 106X, and then CS 107, while it's not really object-oriented course, at least it's a heavy-duty programming course. CS 108 is a great object-oriented course. So if you've taken CS 108, you'll probably be really well prepped. 110, again, not really too much an object-oriented program, but good programming course because there's a lot of programming in this class. In fact, all the work in this class is programming. You will not have a little bit of reading the first couple of weeks just to kind of learn this new language, but it's almost all programming after that all the way to the end, including your final project. So if you're not really comfortable with all these terms, these object-oriented terms, or if you're not just really comfortable with writing big programs, then this class will definitely be a challenge for you. Okay, so what's in iOS? What are the parts of it? It's such a big system. It's got so much in it. It's impossible for me to encapsulate it in a small little summary. But I do have this slide right here that divides it into these 4 layers. These 4 layers are approximately down near the hardware at the bottom, up near the user at the top. Okay, so at the bottom, so a lot of people don't realize that iOS is basically a Unix-based operating system. Okay, it's very similar, shares a lot of the core of Mac OS X. Okay, now it's certainly optimized for mobile devices, which have battery restrictions and things like that. But that is basically what it is. And so down at that layer, you've got sockets and you've got permissions and things like that that have to be near the hardware to work properly. But above that, there's kind of an object-oriented layer that lets you get at a lot of that stuff using object-oriented programming. Okay, and this stuff is not UI oriented. It's more kind of accessing the hardware through object-oriented programming or accessing networking through object-oriented programming. But it's a big layer there. And so we will spend a fair amount of our time in this layer because we need those primitives to build at the higher layers. And then there's this whole layer which I wish we had more time to spend on. We only get 10 weeks in this whole class. It goes by so fast, you'll be amazed, as you're probably used to with your Stanford courses. But there's a whole media layer here, both for static images, you know, JPEG and things like that, and video, both capturing video, editing video, all that. Incredible audio frameworks on this device for doing 3D audio for games and all that. Unfortunately, I get to very little of this layer. I'll try to let you know that it's in there, and then you'll know to go out and seek out, if you're building a very audio-intensive app or a video-intensive app, you'll seek out that layer. But we'll spend the vast majority of our time at the Cocoa Touch layer. So the Cocoa Touch layer, that's where the buttons and sliders and things like that are. This is the layer where you're going to build the interactivity with your end user, and so we probably spend 70+% of our time in the Cocoa Touch layer. And this is a very powerful layer. You know, you've seen things like the Maps app on the phone. There's basically an object that does almost the entire Maps app that you can just drop right into your program. Now you have Maps in your program. Same thing with web browser. If you want to put web browsing in your app, just boom, pop an object in there, call a couple methods, and you're on your way. So it's very powerful, very high level, and there's a lot going on in there, and that's where we'll spend most of our time. Okay? By the way, if you have any questions, I try to glance up. There's bright lights over there sometimes in my way, but shout out or, you know, otherwise get my attention. Feel free to interrupt. Then there's the development platform itself. Okay, what the tools we use to build these iOS apps. What's in that? Well, it's all pretty much now been funneled into this one application called Xcode 6. There are some little adjuncts that it calls out to, but Xcode 6 is everything. It's your code editor, it's your compiler, your debugger, all of that in one pretty awesome app. And so we'll be learning all about Xcode 6 in this class, and that's where you're going to spend all your time developing. You're not going to be at a terminal typing in Emacs or something. We're going to be in Xcode 6. Languages I have, there's actually 2 languages in iOS now. They are peers. You can pretty much use either one. One of them is called Objective-C. That's the language that iOS was originally developed for. It's a language that's been around a long time, probably 30 years. It's been around, or 25 to 30 years that it's actually been used to build stuff that's on the Mac today. So it's a very mature language, but it is also 25, 30 years old. And so Apple last summer introduced a completely new language called Swift. And Swift, you can do pretty much everything in iOS with Swift, and that's the language we're going to learn because it's a modern language. Apple did a great job of kind of building all the best stuff of all the languages that have been invented over the last 25 years, but especially the last probably 5 or 10 years into this language. It's very concise. It's very type-safe language, but has type inference and a lot of things that make it so that you get the best of both worlds of having type safety and not having to be constantly over-specifying everything. So we're going to go Swift only. I'm not even going to really talk about Objective-C. I just don't have time to do both languages. Yeah?
Do you think it would be important to pick Objective-C in the context of doing iOS development?
Yeah, so the question is, if I'm going out into the world to do iOS development in the real world for real companies, am I probably going to have to learn Objective-C? And the answer is, it depends on the company you're at. Probably in the short term, yes, but as the time goes by, probably more and more people switch to Swift. The good thing is the underlying iOS APIs are exactly the same for both. It's just the syntax of the language, a little bit about how the language approaches calling the APIs is slightly different, but everything you learn in here about the underlying parts of iOS will totally work in Objective-C. All the methods are the same, it's just the syntax is a little different. So don't feel too bad about not learning both languages. And once you've learned this language, learning Objective-C, it's going to be pretty easy too. So good question though. All right. Of course, iOS is filled with tons of frameworks. Frameworks are libraries, basically, of objects that you use as building blocks to build your application, and we are going to be covering them. UIKit is the main one. It's got most of the user interface stuff in it. Foundation is that core services layer that I was talking about. And but there's tons of other ones. Core motion for doing the device moving around, gyro and accelerometer. Core data for object-oriented database, things like that. So I'll get to as many of those as I can, especially the big ones. But there's just way too many to cover in 10 weeks. And finally, I put this as a first-class thing with all the rest is a design strategy. MVC, I think I usually ask, or I'll ask this year,